Disney, Mickey's Christmas Storybook Treasury. Mickey's Christmas Carol. Christmas is a time for forgiving, a time to be with one's family. Bob Cratchit. One Christmas Eve, long ago, a thick blanket of white covered the streets of London. Gently falling snow tickled the townsfolk, hurrying home with their Christmas gifts. But one person was not thinking about Christmas trees or presents. He paid no attention to the festively decorated houses. His name was Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge hurried past a group of Christmas carolers. "Penny for the poor," one of them called.
"Bah, humbug,"
Scrooge replied. He wouldn't give a penny to anyone. If the poor wanted to be rich, they could work as hard as he did. Inside Scrooge's office, his assistant, Bob Cratchit, was busy working. Achoo! Cratchit sneezed. It was bitterly cold, and even the ink for his quill had frozen. He didn't think Mr. Scrooge would mind if he used just one little piece of coal. Cratchit carefully opened the furnace. He was just about to put in the piece of coal when the door swung open and Scrooge burst in. Ooh, that was close.
"What are you doing with that piece of coal?"
He shouted at Cratchit. Just trying to thaw out the ink," Cratchit stammered. But Scrooge didn't care.
"You used a piece last week,"
he said.
"Now get on with your work, Cratchit."
While Cratchit went back to copying papers, old Scrooge sat down at his desk and lovingly polished the gold coins until they glowed. Rubbing his hands together with glee, he weighed the coins on his scale and stacked them carefully on the desktop. Suddenly the door flew open with a bang. "Merry Christmas!" Scrooge's nephew Fred shouted. "Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge!"
"Bah, humbug,"
Scrooge snorted.
"What's so merry about it? I'll tell you what Christmas is. It's just another work day."
"But, sir, Christmas is just a time for giving, a time to be with one's family," Cratchit explained.
"I say, bah, humbug," Scrooge
scowled. Fred invited Scrooge to Christmas dinner, but Scrooge refused, and with that, Scrooge kicked his nephew out of the office. Yoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. A while later, Bob Cratchit looked at the clock and stepped down from his stool.
"It's 2 minutes fast,"
Scrooge snapped.
"Oh, never mind. You may go."
"Oh, thank you, sir," Cratchit stammered in his amazement.
"And I suppose you'll be wanting work off tomorrow," Scrooge barked. "But be here all the earlier the next day."
"Thank you, sir, Mr. Scrooge," Cratchit cried. He snapped up Scrooge's bag of laundry and was gone in an instant, shouting, "Merry Christmas," as he went. Later, Scrooge locked up his office and hurried home through the swirling snow, climbing his dark, steep steps. He took an old key from his pocket. As he went to open the door, Scrooge took a closer look at his door knocker. He gasped. On the knocker was the face of an old business partner, Jacob Marley. The face of the door began to move. "Scrooge!" called softly. Frightened, Scrooge yanked the door open and ran inside. He flew up the stairs 3 at a time. Behind him, he heard the sound of chains clanging. Ch, ch. Looking over his shoulder, Scrooge froze in his tracks. The ghost of Marley had come back to haunt him. Scrooge ran into his bedroom and slammed the door. Quickly, he bolted every lock.
"That's it! No ghost can get through that!"
he said. But in the dark shadows of his bedroom, Scrooge shivered.
Clink, clank, clink, clank.
The chains dragged closer and closer. Scrooge sank down in his chair, his teeth chattering in fear. Soon enough, the ghost appeared before him. Chains circled his body. Attached to him were several large, heavy objects. As Marley inched closer to Scrooge, he tripped over Scrooge's cane. The ghost went flying! Scrooge trembled with fright as the ghost picked himself up. "Scrooge, don't you recognize your old business partner?" the ghost asked. "It is I, Jacob Marley." Scrooge took a closer look.
"Marley?
"It is you." The ghost held up his chains. "Ebenezer, remember how when I was alive, I would rob the windows and swindle the poor? I was wrong. And as punishment, I'm forced to carry around these heavy chains through eternity. I'm doomed, and the same thing will happen to you, Ebenezer Scrooge." "No, no, it can't, it mustn't!" Scrooge cried. "Tonight you'll be visited by 3 spirits," Marley continued. "Listen to them. Do what they say, or your chains will be heavier than mine. Farewell, Ebenezer, farewell." And with another clanking of his chains, Marley was gone. Scrooge quickly pulled on his nightshirt and cap, hopped into bed, and pulled the covers right up to his nose. He was almost asleep when a little figure with a top hat on in his head and an umbrella in one hand stepped out of the shadows. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," he told Scrooge. "You must come over with me. There is not a moment to lose." But Scrooge just laughed at the spirit.
"You look how small you are,"
he said.
"You do not scare me. Go away." "Silence!"
ordered the spirit. "If men were measured by their kindness, you would be smaller than a grain of sand." "Catch hold of my coat-tail," the spirit commanded. "We are going back into a time when Christmas was not a humbug." Scrooge hesitated, but remembering Marley's terrible warning, he grasped the spirit and held on tightly. The windows flew open, and instantly Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas past were soaring over rooftops and chimneys, the spirit's little umbrella keeping them aloft. Soon they came to a stop outside a brightly lit house. The spirit set them both down in a freshly fallen snow. Joyful Christmas music drifted through the air. Peering through the windows, Scrooge couldn't believe his eyes.
"Why, it's Isabel!"
he cried, suddenly remembering the girl he'd once loved.
But who is that she's dancing with so merrily?
That man is you, Scrooge, the spirit whispered. In the days when you two were kind and cheerful. They watched a moment longer, and then Spirit whisked Scrooge away in another scene. Scrooge and the Spirit peered through another window. Inside, the Scrooge of many years before sat behind a desk, covered in money. Isabel stood in front of him, tears in her eyes.
Is this my office? Scrooge asked. Why is Isabel crying?
The Spirit gave Scrooge a withered look, and suddenly Scrooge remembered he had taken Isabel's home from her when she could not pay her bills, and had refused to marry her. The Spirit turned from the window. Your greed drove her away, Ebenezer. You were to marry her, but you loved only your money, and you lost her forever. The Spirit turned from the window. Your greed drove her away, Ebenezer. You were to marry her, but you loved only your money, and you lost her forever. No, Scrooge moaned softly. I love Isabel. Please, I cannot bear her these moments. Take me home. Suddenly Scrooge found himself once more in his bed.
That couldn't have happened, he said. I couldn't have flown through the air. That was just a bad dream.
Then he thought of Isabel, and how his love for money had ruined his chance for happiness with her. Scrooge put his head down and sobbed into his pillow. He cried, and as he cried, Scrooge suddenly felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. Scrooge raised his head and found a fierce-looking giant feasting beside his bed. I am the ghost of Christmas present, boomed the giant.
Oh, please, cried Scrooge. Spare me!
The giant picked up Scrooge by his nightshirt and examined him closely.
No! Don't hurt me! Please! Have mercy! Take my treasure, you can have it all!
Scrooge cried. Keep your treasure, Scrooge, the Spirit replied. It is of no use to me. Money cannot buy happiness, and only my generosity can save you now.
Have a grape, won't you?
The Spirit told. Have a grape, won't you? The Spirit told Scrooge, dropping him down into the middle of his feast. Slipping and sliding, Scrooge called out for help, but the Spirit just laughed. I have the power to give you life, but what have you ever given? The Spirit asked Scrooge. Let us take a look. There's no time to lose, the Spirit cried, scooping up Scrooge and putting him in his pocket. He pushed open the roof, and stepped outside, as though from a doll's house. Scrooge peeked out of the giant's pocket. I wonder where we're going, he said to himself. Scrooge peeked out of the giant's pocket.
I wonder where we're going,
he said to himself. Pulling Scrooge from his pocket, the Spirit tore a street lamp from the ground to use as a lantern. They soon were on their way. Shortly, the Spirit and Scrooge arrived at a tiny run-down house.
What a dreadful little house,
Scrooge exclaimed, looking in the window.
Who could live in such a place? Perhaps a miserable beggar?
Look closely, Scrooge, advised the Spirit. and tell me who you see." Scrooge pressed his face against the glass for a better look.
"Why, it's Bob Cratchit, my clerk,"
he said with surprise.
"Does he live here?"
The spirit scowled. "Look at how he lives. Thanks to your generosity. Look at the food his family must eat this Christmas Eve, because it's all they can afford." The hungry Cratchit family sat at their table, about to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had ever seen in his life.
"Surely they have more food than that,"
Scrooge said.
"Look on the fire. That's your laundry."
The hungry Cratchit family sat at their table, about to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had ever seen in his life.
"Surely they must have more food than that,"
Scrooge said. "Look on the fire. That's your laundry," the spirit said. Scrooge was ashamed as he watched a boy named Tiny Tim hobbled into the room. Leaning on a little crutch, he gave thanks to Scrooge for their meal.
"Tell me, spirit, what's wrong with that kind lad?"
Scrooge asked. I'm much.
"Tell me, spirit, what's wrong with that kind lad?"
Scrooge asked. "Much, I'm afraid," the spirit replied. "If these shadows remain unchanged, I see an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat." Suddenly the scene went dark. When Scrooge stepped back from the window, the spirit had disappeared. Only 2 giant footprints indicated that he had been there at all. In the distance, church bells tolled.
"Don't go!"
Scrooge cried.
"You must tell me about Tim! Don't go!"
Just then, the swirling smoke grew thicker and thicker until Scrooge could not see anything around him. The smoke blew into his nose, and he coughed. As the smoke lifted, Scrooge looked around. He was standing in a graveyard. There were tombstones everywhere, covered by a layer of snow. Scrooge looked up. He was no longer alone. A horrible shadow, his face hidden with his cloak, stood silently before him.
"Are you the ghost of Christmas future?"
Scrooge stammered.
"Tell me, what will happen with Tiny Tim?"
The spirit looked at Scrooge silently and raised his large arm. Scrooge looked to where the spirit was pointing into the distance. He saw Bob Cratchit and his family gathered around a tombstone. They were all crying. Bob Cratchit knelt before the little gravestone. Gently he laid Tiny Tim's crutch on the grave, tears rolling down his face.
"Oh no,"
Scrooge cried.
"Spirit, I don't want this to happen. Tell me that these events can yet be changed."
Suddenly church bells tolled again. Scrooge noticed 2 grave diggers finishing a fresh grave.
"I've never seen a funeral like this one," the first one said. "No mourners, no friends to bid him farewell," the second one chimed in. "Oh well," the first one added, "let's rest a minute before we fill it in, eh?"
He ain't going nowhere," the second replied as they both walked off, laughing.
"Ha!"
Scrooge peered down into the grave.
"Spirit, whose lonely grave is this?"
he asked.
"Why, it's yours, Ebenezer,"
the spirit laughed as his hood fell from his face.
The richest man in the cemetery,
the spirit crackled. As he pushed Scrooge into the grave, it burst into flames.
No! No! No!
Scrooge cried.
I'll change! Let me out!
Scrooge screamed.
Let me!
Suddenly another bell tolled. Scrooge opened his eyes and shouted with joy. He was in his room! Scrooge jumped up and ran to the window. The sun shone brightly, and the church bells were ringing.
It's Christmas morning!
Scrooge cried.
I haven't missed it. The spirits have given me another chance. I know just what I'll do. They'll be so surprised. There's so much to do.
Throwing on his coat and hat, Scrooge raced out the door. As Scrooge ran down the road, he saw his nephew, Fred, approaching in a wagon.
I'm looking forward to that wonderful meal of yours,
Scrooge said merrily.
You're coming?
Fred asked in disbelief.
Of course I am,
Scrooge replied. Fred was so surprised by his uncle's cheerfulness that he almost fell off his carriage. Waving goodbye to his nephew, Scrooge continued on his way.
Rat-tat!
Bob Cratchit heard a sharp knock and opened his door. His face fell when he saw one who was standing on the step. It was Scrooge, holding a big brown sack on his back. He looked very angry. "Why, Mr. Scrooge, Merry Christmas! Won't you come in?" Scrooge stomped into the living room.
Merry Christmas! Ha! I have another bundle for you,
Scrooge said, dropping the heavy bag to the floor. But sir, it's Christmas Day, Cratchit stammered.
Christmas Day indeed. Just another excuse for being lazy,
Scrooge scowled.
And another thing, Cratchit, I've had enough of this day off stuff. You leave me no alternative but to give you toys!
Tiny Tim shouted. Pulling open the bag, parcels tied with bright ribbons and bows tumbled from the sack. Scrooge laughed as the children's faces lit up with joy. Scrooge smiled at Cratchit.
I'm giving you a raise and making you my partner.
Cratchit couldn't believe it. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Scrooge. Merry Christmas, Bob," Scrooge said it, as the whole family danced with joy. It was a Christmas miracle. "And God bless everyone," said Tiny Tim. The end.